Hello writers, and welcome to a glorious sunny afternoon here in my studio. I wanted to share a video with you today about a pile of books that I brought back from Yorkshire to Mexico City on a flight last week, and which filled my cabin bag. But then I realised that the most important thing is to find a theme for those, rather than just recount 30 or 40 books that were in my cabin bag as something I wanted for my studio here in Mexico City. And I've looked at the theme, and I think what I really want to talk about is how we find our voice as writers and where perhaps that influence comes from. When I was 18 years old, I started to learn Spanish, and I was taught by a guy called Joe Morley in Nottinghamshire. I used to travel from my village in my mum's Renault 4 car and go to Spanish lessons near Woollerton Park in Nottingham, which, if any of you are watching from the East Midlands, you'll know is a gorgeous urban park created for the city. And Joe lived in a property there. He was a retired man, and in his last few years in England, before he then subsequently left Nottingham and went to live in Tenerife. But this Cassell's Colloquial Spanish is one of the books that I brought with me over on the flight the other week, and it's done me great service for 40 odd years and helped me enormously in my learning of language. My main books at the moment are self-help books. Climbing Out of Debt, 10-Minute Budget, Simple Self-Help, and Declutter Your Home are the most popular and most regularly sold books. And the whole idea of me writing self-help books comes probably from an early exposure to things like, when I was a Boy Scout, positive attitude manuals and booklets. And one of the books that I brought with me on this particular trip is by Baden-Powell. It's called Life's Snags and How to Meet Them by Baden-Powell. This particular copy I have had since childhood. It wasn't originally mine, or rather it came to me from my grandfather, but let's see when it was printed. It was actually printed, the third impression of this book was printed in 1930. So printed in 1930, so that means it's more than 90 years old, 93 years old. And here are some of the topics. So as a kid I was reading chapters such as Your Real Motives in Life, The Profiteers of Youth, The Will is the Main Thing, Watch Your Habits, Sloppiness, The Monday Spirit, Happy Staff, Climbing as Education, Success, and Stick-to-itiveness, as if that's a particular phrase. But the idea that I was reading books like this as a youngster and then hanging on to them throughout my adolescent years and into university years, that's a strong indication that how-to books and self-help books from such a long time ago have served me a great value. So that's Life Snags by Lord Baden-Powell. Here are a few other books. When I first came to Mexico as a second-year student from a degree from Portsmouth University in England, I settled into life in southern Mexico, and I walked at the end of that year, in 1984, I walked from the Pacific coast of Mexico across to the Caribbean, starting at a little tiny fishing port and a one-boat naval base called Puerto Madero, through the mountains, through the jungles, through the flatlands, and finishing at a place called Isla Holbox on the Yucatan coast of Mexico. By the time I was living in Mexico, I was aware of the significance of Isla Holbox, because it was a place where in the 1500s a very small group of Spanish, basically treasure seekers or buccaneers and privateers really, settled. They came over from Cuba. They first made landfall in Yucatan, and this book by Bernal Diaz, The Conquest of New Spain, has been a regular read for me over the last 3 or 4 decades, and I'm reading it again prior to doing a review of it. But a very small band of perhaps 400 Spanish profiteers, later called conquistadores, came through Mexico and made various marched routes along the coast of Mexico, trying different towns, trying different communities, until they found a way into Mexico near Veracruz and made their way from there, gathering factions of support from other local indigenous groups and tribal units, and made their way to Mexico City. But this is one of the books that I brought out with me again, and I've been reading it the last week or so. And I'm halfway through again on what I think is probably my fifth read since I first bought it. Yeah, and looking at the inscription at the front, I bought this with money from my mum and dad on my 20th birthday in 1983. So this book not only was purchased in Portsmouth where I was doing my degree, it then came with me to Mexico in 1983, returned to the UK. It's been back to Mexico several times, and hopefully it's now here on my bookshelf for a settled period of reading as I go through it yet again. Bernal Diaz, The Conquest of New Spain. So we've had a self-help book by the guy who was the founder of the scouting movement in Britain in the early 20th century after his time in the Boer War. Let's look at another book, The Maya World. I bought this in 1983 in the National Anthropology Museum here in Mexico City. That's a place that I was at in December last year with my sons and enjoying time with them again in that location, somewhere I went to with my parents 40 years ago. But The Maya World, it's a very old book, very simple book, written by a guy called Demetrio Morales, who was a fabulous student of Maya culture. But this came to me after a book on Spanish and learning Spanish, taught by Joe Morley in Nottingham. Then I ended up at Portsmouth University doing a Latin American Studies degree, politics, history, literature, language, etc., that has allowed me to be here again and to be living and writing and working here on a nomadic basis, but putting my roots down again in Mexico City. Another book that came out on the plane is Graham Greene's Monsignor Quixote. Don Quixote was the first narrative novel written in Europe by Cervantes from Spain, and Graham Greene took the story of Don Quixote and his servant Sancho Panza and created a modern, funny story, which is an incredibly great read. This is a version from the 1980s, but again, it's coming back to Mexico now and goes on my shelf. These are the advantages of cabin bags and cabin luggage, when I didn't need to bring much back with me because I've already got plenty of stuff here, and I'm creating a busy writing studio and using this space on a regular basis. But we are, I think, largely informed for our current writing by our life experiences, by the people we have spent time with and who have influenced and mentored us in a positive way, and by the experiences of travel and adventure that mentoring and that encouragement leads to. Here's another. This one is very much about northern Spain rather than Latin America. It's called I'm Off Then, by a German comedian called Hapa Kerkeling, Losing and Finding Myself on the Camino de Santiago. The Camino de Santiago is an 800-kilometer footpath that goes from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in the Pyrenean foothills of southern France, right up against the border with Spain, crosses the Pyrenees, goes through amazing medieval cities like Pamplona and Leon, and through across northern Spain to end close to the coast, not at the coast, but end in the beautiful city called Santiago de la Compostela. Compostela is the old Catholic name for the certificate that a pilgrim gets for walking along the pilgrim route and ending in Santiago. The book follows the route from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, the classic route really, called the French route, and goes out west to Santiago de Compostela. It's a hilarious book, very, very fascinating in terms of the characters and some of the insights into the secrets of the Spanish landscape. But again, I wouldn't have read this book had I not started learning Spanish after my A-levels in England, and having to learn another basic level of Spanish before they would accept me at the university in Portsmouth. Where do your writing influences come from, and how have those influenced the way that you choose the themes that you write about? If you're a self-help or a non-fiction writer like me predominantly, although I'm now writing creative fiction stories, where does your inspiration come from? Can you find half a dozen books on your shelves that have been a part of your journey from early stage awakening of ideas and the birth of ideas and inspiration to becoming something that may end up as a physical book, as a practical journal for guidance for people to follow, as a series of e-learning courses? What was it that spiked your interest in the early days of your childhood or the start of your writing activity that has led to you being where you are now with the productivity and the creativity that you bring to the table? Have a think about those ideas. Have a think about and consider the inspiration that has influenced you and shaped your writing and allowed you to find your writing voice. I hope that's been helpful. For me, it was fascinating to think, okay, I'm going to start by looking at this series of books that I brought with me, and in the end, settling instead on just these few books. So 6 books here that have really influenced me, and I can see the step-by-step process from seeking to learn Spanish to starting to explore Spain to making a decision to do a degree which would bring me to Latin America for about a year and a half as a 20-year-old student, and then to making a life that is impacted greatly and shaped by that whole Mexican experience. Find your half dozen books, find your sequence of steps that you took to get yourself to the point where you're writing now, and how you have been influenced by your early reading. I hope that's helpful. Wherever you are in the world, of course, happy writing.